So Declan, give us a sense there, really, John, of how this work of history, this work of fact, first of all, it changed in your own telling of it, which is very interesting in the initial writing, and then the changes, some of the changes that we get in the film, which is, whatever, an hour and 48 minutes long and very condensed, and certainly at the end, as you say, a lot of that political playing out of prisoner of war stuff. We just don't get into the subtleties of what was or wasn't going on there. You're no stranger to this, John. Deliverance was a novel to start out with. The General is based on fact.
Yes.
Your own Hope and Glory, which was interesting. I was looking at IMDb today, which is referred to as semi-autobiographical, and maybe this is the hint about it all. Is it semi-autobiographical because the bits that don't fit into the film for the purposes of telling it over the space of an hour and a half or 2 hours, whatever length it's going to be, they just have to go. You have to dispense with the facts and tell the story that works on a screen.
Well, in the case of Hope and Glory, which is about my memories of Blitz, the London Blitz, is that I started off by writing down my most vivid memories. My working title was Shrapnel and Other Fragments. And my daughter said, "You can't call it that. It sounds like a slim volume of poetry." But then I tried to dramatize it. And when I finished the script, dramatizing is put it in some kind of emotional order. And I showed it to my mother and my older sister, who were very much involved in this, and very much about my mother's lover and my sister's lover. And so I showed it to them. And I said, if there's not anything they don't want me to show, I'll take it out. Well, they were astonished because things I thought I'd invented had actually happened. And somehow I'd absorbed them by osmosis or some other method. And so I think imagination is often more reliable than facts. And the play of the relationship between imagination and memory is very interesting. Also, in your film, the audience knows what the outcome is, and yet it's incredibly suspenseful. Yeah. And that's one of the mysteries of movies, is that, like The Day of the Jackal about the assassination of Charles de Gaulle, is that that he doesn't get assassinated, but the whole film is about preparing to assassinate him, and you are on your edge of your seat. And that's a strange way that movies manipulate us. I mean, it's not a deliberate manipulation. It's the mysterious nature of suspense, and I don't know how to explain it, but it exists. It's like the notion of identification. You mentioned The General, which is about Martin Cahill, the gangster, and it was, when I previewed the film, the audience just loved this awful man. So I recut it and made him nastier and more awful and crueler than ever before. And the audience loved him even more. And it was like, I think Brecht had this problem with Mutter Courage, Mother Courage. She is this dreadful woman, who does any crime to protect her kids. And audiences just loved her. And he did the same thing. He rewrote it, making her nastier and more awful. And the more awful she became, the more they loved her. So identification is another mystery. Is that when we watch a film, if we're absorbed by it, we identify with the leading characters. It doesn't matter what they are, and we kind of live their life. The process of watching a film is the process of living the story through the leading character or characters. So that's something that is inexplicable, and I don't know how to deal with it, but I just recognise it.
And so maybe I muddied the water slightly about mixing hope and glory and the general in there with my question about book to screen, because I suppose Deliverance is maybe a clearer example of what I think is a work of fiction, although there may be large parts of it that could happen. Maybe that's what fiction, why it's so close to fact. That was taking a novel and bringing it to the screen. Do you kind of have to throw the novel away, or sort of throw it up in the air and say, let's let it fall now as a film, forget about the page?
Well, when I heard James Dickey, the author of the novel, is a poet, very fine poet, and when I went down to Atlanta to meet him, I went down with my production manager, and he took me on one side, and he said, I'm going to tell you something I never told a living soul. Everything in that book happened to me, including the buggery scene and killing a man. And he made me promise to keep it a complete secret, so I couldn't wait to tell someone. I told him. Came out of the house, I told him, you know what he told me? And my production manager said, yeah, he told me the same thing. And then he proceeded to tell everybody who would listen to him. And when I got up and I got into a canoe with him, I realized, as he got into a canoe, that nothing in that book had happened to him. He was, and I said to Joe, I'm much more impressed by someone who could imagine that story than someone who could live it. But so, you know, we then had a lot of discussions and arguments about developing it into a screenplay rather than a novel, because, for instance, the first third of the novel describes these four men and their lives in Atlanta, their comfortable lives, and a vague air of discontent that they somehow weren't fulfilling themselves, and somehow then this trip on this river made men of them. And so I started the film with the men arriving up in the hills for this trip. And I said, you know, this is what happens, you know, that in a film, the characters, the nature of the characters, the acting, describes them. You don't have to show where they live. And so it went on, and you don't have to throw the novel away, because what he had there were four very, very interesting characters. What I couldn't go along with was the outcome. And so I forged it into a movie. When the movie came out, Jim Dickey said, it's better than the book. He'd tell everybody. But then he disavowed it, and last year of his life, he tried to get one of the Hollywood studios to remake it with his script. And of course, nobody wanted to do that. But he was a remarkable man. When we were rehearsing, he was always hanging around, and the actors got really spooked by him, because he would only address them by the names of the characters they were playing. And he was kind of living book.
And Daniel Day-Lewis wasn't in the movie. He would have been delighted with being
Yeah.
dressed as that, I would have thought.
But so eventually, I said, Jim, you have to leave and let's get on with it. And so he said, well, finally, very reluctantly, he said, all right, but I want to say goodbye to the boys. So I said, okay. So we went down to where we were rehearsing, and he drew himself up, and he was 6'3", and he drew himself with these fierce eyes, and he said, it appears that my presence will be most efficacious by its absence. And he turned and walked away. And Bert Reynolds said to me, does that mean he's going or he's staying?
I should say at this point that I'm halfway down page 1 of my questions, and it's we're almost an hour in. Now, the great joy of tonight not being a live broadcast is that if Julianne is there somewhere, can she? Yes, I can. Can I keep going? I can. I will keep going with both of your. I don't know whether that means my presence is going to be most efficacious by not being absent or not. I have to think that one through. There are a couple of things that I really want to pick up on that, again, I think transfer between the theatre of operations and the theatre of that operation. Very early on, first page, in fact, John, of the novel, we meet this star. What's her name? Alison. Isn't it Alison? Yeah. And there's a big debate at the end of the first page, and it goes on for a bit in the book, about a tear at the end of the movie, a CGI tear.
Yes.
I get the impression that you are not a fan of CGI tears, of CGI anything, in fact, computer-generated images.
Well, I think the CGI, computer-generated images, the movies have lost their innocence, because when we were watching a film, we knew that it had occurred at some place and time, and now you can't be sure what you're seeing. And there's something mechanical about it. Yes, this actress couldn't cry, so they created this CGI tear. And this CGI tear haunts this picture. People get to hear about it, and it haunts the picture. And it's a metaphor for the artifice of that CGI brings to the cinema.
But interesting, later on, the producer character, what's his name? The producer of the film, not Daniel, the other. What's his name? I can't remember. Yeah, you forget. That's okay. Then I'm allowed to get to. I have it written down here somewhere. Yeah. I will get there eventually when I get my glasses on. No, that's all the stuff about the producer of the film, whose name neither of us can remember. He points out that, but sure, for years, Hollywood is a false city full of people faking emotions.
Yes.
So that, in fact, in a very bleak way, he points out that there's nothing left now but fake. There is no reality. Everything is made up, which fits in with a lot of what we're watching on our television screens in the news at the moment.
Yes.
How bleak a view is that in fact everything is fake?
Yes. Yes. Well, there is a sense. I lived in Los Angeles for 2 or 3 years, and I had the sense that people had forgotten the basic humanity, and they were acting people, pretending to be people, and it was all this thing of I remember being on the beach there, and there was a woman, and she had a baby, and she had a maid who was looking after the baby, and she was reading a book about how to bond with your baby. And that seemed to sum it up to me.
The producer's name, by the way, is Jack Diamond.
Jack Diamond.
That's his name.
And he goes back, he's been living in Europe and New York, and he goes back there and he sees this fake city with fake people. who are simulating emotions, and it's completely scary. He goes to visit his ex-wife, who has, had a lot of cosmetic surgery, and there are some wonderful people at that. I have wonderful friends in Los Angeles, but for the most part, you can't help feeling that it's all fake, and that the movies that they make have more reality than the people who make them.
In itself is a frightening prospect. Yeah, the quote that he has is, for 100 years Hollywood actors have been simulating emotions in a simulated city. Now only the fake is genuine.
Yeah.
Which is very close to what the novelist friend said, the writer of Deliverance said to the cast, in fact.
Yes.
And the reason I bring up that whole thing about technology, Declan, is I'm not reading from Declan's book now, I'm reading from John's book. This is back to this character, Harold, and it's in that scene where this 2001 A Space Odyssey is mentioned. And in fact, in this quote that I'm going to read, he's referring to that time, and he's speaking to the producer's wife, Bella, and this is what he says. In those days, you were in a trench with a rifle. You could choose your targets and pick them off one by one. We don't have that kind of time no more. We have cruise missiles. They make big hits. Sometimes there's collateral damage. A few pictures die in the margins. For pictures put in innocent people, and we're straight back to you, Declan. What has the effect of, not CGI images, but we've all seen, we've all watched war on television now, where there's a building sitting there on the screen, the building is gone. We don't see people. Yeah. We don't see anything happening. It's become like
dehumanized.
And it's like a video game.
Yeah.
What effect has that had on? If this again, this is a course in philosophy, but what effect has that had on how wars are fought by soldiers? They don't have to pick their targets. See a man or a woman that they are shooting die in front of them. It's a lot easier, it would seem, is it?
Oh, well, it is. You're absolutely right. I've never had any direct involvement in that, but I've known people that in recent years that have, and yeah, they do. You're desensitized, and you're looking at. You have this barrier between you and the consequences of what you've done. Heretofore, if a soldier or anybody who was tasked with the exercise of lethal force, a police officer or whatever else, when you're doing it, you're not really, that's the enemy, and you've desensitized them. But in the aftermath, you can see the aftermath and you're aware of that. And that's usually if there's trauma or post-traumatic stress, it's as a consequence of that. I don't think it's a terribly healthy thing, either personally, but even strategically, for an obsession with trying to fight wars remotely. It has its role, but what I mean is, A, yes, you get a body of people who are desensitized, but B, you get a state that becomes desensitized, and they start to think, well, we can contain this without having to commit troops to the theatre. And it's not a healthy development in that regard, because you're deluding yourself that you think you're winning a war if you're doing it all from an armchair back in Texas or somewhere like that with a little joystick and you're flying your drone. Now, drones have been successful in recent times in decapitating the leadership of Al-Qaeda. There is no doubt about that. Has it done away with Islamic terrorism? No, it hasn't. Will it? No, it won't. There's an old saying that...
Would straightforward warfare do that?
Warfare won't do it full stop. But sometimes there is... It has to be... I think I heard somebody talking about this earlier today on Sean O'Rourke's, Louise Richardson, actually. Terrorism can't be dealt with. It can be contained to an extent by military or law enforcement means until a political settlement can come out of it, or it can help bring people to the point where they realise they have to engage in dialogue or a political settlement. And my essence of my point is, if you start to think, we found a blood-free, for our side anyway, of making war, you go down a rabbit hole of delusion, because there is an old saying that you don't win the ground until the infantry have stood over the enemy and driven the bayonet into their throat. Okay, it's a bit graphic, but But it just reminds us that there is a cost to war, and Robert Fisk said it better than me recently in an article. You know, if you feel, if one side are doing all the dying and your side are, you know, in the mess in time for coffee the next morning because either they were sitting in a shed with the joystick or they were flying so far above the battlefield, it changes the dynamic, and the state at policy level don't, you know, they start to delude themselves that we can deal with this without having to put boots on the ground. Now, when I say boots on the ground, I'm not just talking about infantry, about troops. And I think if I can be so bold as to kind of link into maybe contemporary times with the new presidency we're about to witness in the States, there's a lot of other things that have to be done to contain conflict that require boots on the ground in a slightly softer way. Getting in, working with the militaries or the law enforcement of a newly built state to try and give them strength in depth, to train them, to give them a planning ability. There's a lot of other things in terms of injecting human rights awareness into forces. I spent a bit of time on EU-funded projects in parts of Africa. Nigeria was the most recent one, where in order to help them contain terrorism, one of the side aspects was getting into the field to educate on the fly military officers in basic human rights. Because it's not about killing all the enemy. Sometimes you will certainly in anti-terrorism, you will make more ground by not killing them, by, you know, if you can, take them prisoner, de-radicalise them, and they become ball carriers of a new type of way of doing business, if you get my drift. So going back to my point, if you think that you can solve the messy business of conflict, and it's not nation state anymore, it's, you know, you have different kinds of actors. If you think you can do it by sitting, you know, keeping your people safe, delivering the munitions, even if you are killing the enemy as opposed to innocent people, you're not. It'll be like whack-a-mole. You'll decapitate the leadership for a bit. The philosophy is still there. The desire to commit, as we see with Salafist terrorism, is still there. And that won't be dealt with unless you get into a combination where you use a mixture of military means, political means, diplomatic means. And it's a messy business, and it can only be done with people on the ground.
Briefly, because again, I want to get to this question. It was kind of nearly the first question I should have asked you in some ways. Why was the bravery and the actions, why were the actions of the men in Jadoville ignored for so long? I know this is probably what you tried to discover in the writing of the book. Mm-hmm. Are you any closer to knowing why?
Yes.
Why?
Immaturity. Immaturity of the Irish state. We were a fledgling state trying to be a grown-up state. We all now know about the Magdalen laundries, clerical abuse, various kinds of abuse. We tried to portray ourselves primarily to ourselves as this holier-than-thou nation. You know, we kind of came out the other end of the Second World War, where we were very fortunate not to have really got dragged into it, but it left us at the policy-making level with a sort of a sense of moral superiority. And if you follow that, if you read the history of that, it left us with that kind of a notion. And we blundered into the Congo, you know, at policy-making level, because it was something that we were committed to in terms of helping formerly colonised countries get on their feet. Very noble. Don't get me wrong, all in favour of that. But we didn't think of the mechanics of how that was going to be done. And we still had a very one-dimensional understanding of life. So when a bunch of Irish troops had to surrender, and it was on the world stage, well, at the policy-making level, at the ordinary level, had they been all killed, we could have had a lovely parade down O'Connell Street, we'd put a monument up to them, like what happened with Niemba, and we'd never have examined the consequences of how they actually got killed.
Briefly, would they have made a difference? You mentioned earlier, you were talking about somebody receiving the DSM, the Distinguished Service Medal.
Yeah.
How important are awards for soldiers? And you can know that I'm coming to you about that after this.
Awards are very important for soldiers. The physical thing for old soldiers who've committed their life to the service of being able to wear something. You know, it's tangible. I had this discussion with the Department of Defence recently, and we were talking about scrolls. Willie O'D gave them scrolls 20 years ago. As I said, like, this is like, you want to give them another scroll. So it's like inviting a guy to dinner and giving him 2 starter courses and saying, that's your lot. You know, they won't give them medals because the medals board sat. And if they overturn one medals board, they'll have to overturn, you know, they could look at overturning all kinds of other medals boards. But I like to think that where we are now, and the fact that the whole of the country and beyond know about their exploits and that they acted with professionalism and honour, that sort of balances the ante. They could have got DSNs 10 years ago and nobody would know about Shadowville anymore.
Yeah. And I come to you on this one, John. This is early in the book. You mentioned that there are real people and real actors. And this is a scene which involves, I think it's at a dinner after the screening in Cannes, and Quentin Tarantino is there and Sean Penn is there. And Daniel, the director, is sitting at the table. And this is how it goes. Quentin patted and squeezed Daniel's shoulder. Great movie. His attention had drifted to the next table. Hey, there's Sean Penn, he cried. Quentin gathered up his goodwill and took it to the next table. Virtue was sucked from Dan's table as the Tarantino effect shifted onto Sean Penn, hotly tipped for the Best Actor prize. He plays a hunchback, a shoe-in, said Jack Diamond ruefully. But a hunchback and a clubfoot? That's too much for Cannes, said Daniel. That's an Oscar performance, not a Cannes performance. Are you much happier with your 2 Cannes Best Director awards than you would have been with? Because you were nominated 5 times for Academy Awards.
Yes.
Does Cannes hold more cachet?
Oh, I don't. I think these awards really are fairly arbitrary. And, I mean, actually, going to the Oscars and being nominated, I mean, for Hope and Glory, I was nominated as writer, director, and producer, and I didn't win anything. And if you lose, you're treated like shit. You almost feel guilty and inferior not to have won. And people don't want to touch you because they want to touch the winner because it may, the virtue might communicate. So I don't know. Anyway, I've sent all my awards, which were covering my piano. I've sent them all off with my archive to a university, and when that truck drove out of my house with all my papers of my awards and all my photographs and everything, I felt this great feeling of lightness. I felt so relieved, and so it doesn't mean much.
I suppose it doesn't mean much when you have them and you can give them away. If you don't get them, it probably means an awful lot. I should open up because we do need to finish up before it's bedtime and we're all asleep. Any questions from the audience, first of all? Yes?
You mentioned hate. How do we overturn hate? Because what these Islamist groups feel for the West is pure hatred. How do we change that?
Oh, I could say ask me a sports one. But no, it's a very valid question. I'm an optimist by nature, and I've also worked with a lot of different types of people of the Muslim faith. And one thing I've learned over the years is that there are many layers within Islam. Like Christianity, it's not one size fits all. And there's a particular strain within Islam, as I mentioned it there, the Salafist Wahhabist. It's okay, I'm not going to get into the minutiae of it. But that's where a lot of the particular thinking, that hateful thinking you're talking about, emanates from. And I'm a firm believer that the only way we move forward on this is in a partnership with the rest of the Islamic community, because we sometimes forget that there are large swathes of the Islamic community who have been decimated, brutalized by that particular type of thinking. And what we need is, we need their understanding, their comprehension, their cultural and theological comprehension, because that's where I was involved in de-radicalisation and countering violent extremism programs in Africa. And one of the key things was having imams, having message carriers that had authenticity and that had standing, so that the guys who were prisoners or whoever else would pay attention, and their mindset would change. Now, it's not going to happen overnight, but I do believe that the crux of changing that sense of hatred happens within a partnership with the wider Islamic community. And I do believe there is a concept of Western Islam, people who are generations here, who, in Western Europe, who have this, they're devout Muslims, but just like those of us who are still Catholics, we're different types of Catholics to what we were 50 years ago, shall we say. So, I don't know if that helps answer.
May I ask one more question, please?
Of John?
John, Excalibur and Wagner. I had a friend who came to me many years ago and he said to me, there's some Wagner reviewed Excalibur, and he asked me to listen to some of it. So essentially, why Wagner and Excalibur?
Well, so first of all, before I made Excalibur, I went to see the Ring Cycle, Wagner's Ring Cycle at Bayreuth, and I was enormously affected by it. And of course, what the Ring Cycle is about is quite close, really, to the Arthurian legend. And so it just felt right and appropriate.
And had you any qualms about, the attachments sometimes made to Wagner's music? The Nazi attachments?
Which?
The Nazi attachments that are sometimes made to Wagner's music.
No, not at all. I mean, it never bothered me because, I think Wagner's music is so profound and it runs so deep that it transcends any of those attachments like Nazism.
Do we have a further question yet? Gentleman here?
Declan talked about changing mindsets, and obviously you want to do that as well with your book, and it just changes the political attitudes being there.
Yeah.
Can I ask John, is that something he looks to doing with his films, or believes in film, or does entertainment supersede that?
The question is, Declan had talked about changing mindsets within his book, that's part of what he was doing.
Yes.
The question is, do you feel that film can do that, or is it a role that film should have? Is it something that concerns you in the making of a film, changing a mindset?
I think what film does can do is that if you're confronted by an ethical problem or some political issue, if you've seen it dealt with on film well, you can. It has had an emotional effect, which can affect the way you deal with it intellectually. But I think it doesn't change. Film doesn't change minds, but it emotionalizes the issues.
Lady at the back there.
Hello, a question for John, and I'm thinking of the Netflix model of movie making. Declan's film got a global audience by being distributed through Netflix, and I wonder, John, what you thought of that model.
The question is about the Netflix model of film distribution.
Yes.
Declan's, the film of Jadaville it was hugely big part of it's been seen by such a wide audience. Is it being on that platform? What do you think of that method of distribution?
Well, it's not film distribution, it's television distribution. And your film, Netflix reluctantly allowed it to be seen on a cinema screen, something that they normally don't allow at all. The problem with it is that you're seeing it on a small screen, so it's not the cinema. But it certainly revitalized a lot of filmmaking. Netflix and Amazon, there are several, and the HBO kind of serial TV, high-end TV program have also revitalized the writing. I think that they allow much more latitude in the studios. The studios have boxed themselves into a corner where they can only make films that are guaranteed to be immensely popular and appealing to a huge audience, so that anything which is ambiguous or difficult has to be eradicated before it can be seen. Whereas Netflix certainly allows all kinds of possibilities, and it's greatly to be welcomed.
I'll take one more question from the audience if there is one. Go on. Is there any, sorry, just before, is there anybody else? Because obviously, is there anybody else? No, there
There's
isn't.
2 more films in the 30 or 50 minutes.
sorry.
Oh yeah, I will come back to that, gentleman. Yeah,
Sorry.
yeah, yeah. Go ahead. Yeah.
Declan, as you know, my uncle, we buried him in Mullingar on Wednesday.
Will you identify yourself just for the rest of us? Sorry, if you don't mind.
Your nephew Bill Reedy's, is it?
Yes, that's right. Yes. One of the things that I sometimes asked Bill before he passed away was the possibility that there could have been Irish mercenaries involved in the Congo as well. I mean, we know for a fact that the notorious Mike Hoare was involved in the Simba rebellion, but that took part in another part of the Congo. But the mercenaries that were raged against Quinlan's troops, would they have been exclusively Belgian, French, or South African? Would they have been any possibility that there was Irish mercenaries there too?
Just to answer about Mike Hoare, Mad Mike Hoare, his Unit 5 Commando, they didn't come on the scene until a few years later, and you're absolutely right, it was the Simba Rebellion. At that stage, the UN were winding down. It was a different kettle of fish. There was some talk that he had been in situ around the area of Jadava. That was all mythology. And at that point, there were probably quite a few Irishmen involved in mercenary activities, but it was a different kind of context. In the situation you're talking about, there were predominantly French and Belgian. They were mainly French because the French had there had been an attempted coup against de Gaulle in Algeria by the 1st Foreign Legion Parachute Regiment, which was disbanded. And there was a bunch of redundant French Foreign Legionnaire officers and NCOs that went en masse to Africa. That was the reason why so many of them were French. There was talk, as is shown kind of in the film, that it suited French foreign policy. Certainly some of them, like Bob Denard, were freelancers for French intelligence doing destabilisation operations. The Belgians that were there were a mixture of paid-off paracommandos who elected to stay on and make better money, so they hoped, and some of them, like a guy called Black Jack Schramm, who was a planter and sort of a semi-Belgian aristocrat who was made his life in the Congo and so had an interest in fighting for it. There is rumoured that there were 1 or 2 Irish. I don't think there were any Irish in the actual battle against the Irish at Jadava, because I would have heard something definite about it. I do know that Commandant Quinlan later, I think it was in Wynn's Hotel, which is synonymous with the clergy, some years later bumped into a guy, or heard of a guy when he was in the bar, that was bragging about having been a mercenary in the Congo, who was Irish. And he went down to have a conversation with him that ended outside in the street with the same mercenary left on his ass. I heard that from 2 or 3 different witnesses. But there was a few interesting things happening. It should be mentioned, there was a guy called Charles Carney, who rarely gets a mention, and Hamish Matheson. Charles was a Wexford man. He was a technician with the Union Miniere, one of the big mining interests, as was Hamish. And they went out there long before trouble started, and they were doing their work. When this action at Jadava started, they, at great risk to their own lives, passed information to Quinlan, which enabled him to be that little bit more prepared. They later gave further assistance to the UN on a reconnaissance patrol where they got captured, and they could have been shot as spies. They didn't have the protection of being part of a military force. They've never... Carney only got a presentation there recently to his widow. He's dead. From the veterans themselves. The state never recognised him. They say, we don't have any honour system. I think it's a bit of a cop-out. The man is a genuine modern-day patriot in my book. There were also some guys, Irish people, who were in Rhodesia, northern Rhodesia, and it was reputed that they were monitoring radio communications, because the Irish did most of their operational radio communications Oscuelga in Irish, and that they were translating it. Again, I never nailed that down, and to be honest, it wouldn't have made much difference. So the Irish straddled both sides of the equation, depending on where their interests lay, those Irish that were settlers out there. But I don't think there were any Irish actually fighting on the other side directly against them at Jadava at that time.
One sentence question, then we've got to go.
Okay, there's 189 pages in the unit history of the 35th Battalion in military archives. There's 2 more films in it. One is Boorman and Declan, and the other is Smock Alley Theatre. Both of them are set in Dublin. 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 Both of them are set in
you going to make another film? Because you have another book on the way, don't you?
I do, yeah. And that's to do with the Medal for Gallantry and the stories behind that. And actually, just as you said, it's taking more of a direction as to the cost of valour, the cost, the psychological cost of men who put their lives on the line. But in answer to what you say there, I know Leo Quinlan, son of Pat, has been working away assiduously at the broader story behind B Company and what happened afterwards and what happened before. You know what it boils down to? If somebody has an interest in financing something like that, and I know the Irish Film Board were very good to give money for script development to Ritchie in the early days, and that's what put that project on the map and made people sit up and take notice. Maybe something like that might happen again.
Is this going to make it to the screen?
I'm willing to sell the film rights.
Are you willing to direct it?
No, I'm not.
You're not willing to direct it.
No, that's why I'm writing books, because it's much too strenuous making films.
I'll finish up with a quote from the book, if that's okay, Julianne, because it brings together what you just said about if somebody would pay for it, and the prescience. I don't know when you wrote this, but it's particularly apt at the moment. It's back to that great scene with that movie mogul in it, the Harold Witt guy. And he says, "It's a jungle out there, brutal. And you know who wins? The biggest, toughest honcho. Survival of the fittest. Like this presidential election. You know who's going to win? The bitch, or the son of a bitch, who spends most money on TV spots. The same with the movies." John Boorman, Declan Parr, thank you very much. Thanks for